I'm standing in a parking lot at 11 at night, engine off, hands shaking so bad I can barely hold my phone. On the screen is a photo I was never supposed to see. My husband, another woman, a little girl who has his exact same smile. 3 years. That's how long he'd been living this life without me knowing a single second of it. And here's the part that's going to make your stomach drop the way mine did. I wasn't looking for this. I found it by accident on a Tuesday while doing something as boring as updating our shared cloud storage. One photo. That's all it took to blow up everything I thought was real. I didn't scream. I didn't call him. I didn't even cry. Not right away. I just sat there in that dark parking lot and made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. I wasn't going to confront him. I was going to end him. Quietly, legally, completely. And by the time he realized what was happening, it would already be too late for him to stop it. Stick around, because what I did next is the reason people keep telling me I should write a book instead of just a comment section confession. Hey, welcome. I'm so glad you clicked on this one. If you're new here, I tell true stories. Some mine, some from women who trusted me enough to share theirs, about betrayal, and about what happens when someone finally decides they're done being the victim in their own life. This story is mine, every bit of it. And I need you to do one thing before we get into it. Hit subscribe now, because I promise you, the version of me at the beginning of this story is not the version of me by the end of it. Things are going to get so much worse before they get better. Worse than you're imagining right now. Worse than that photo in the parking lot. So buckle up, let's go back to the beginning, back when I actually believed I had the good one. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I'm Sarah, because that's close enough and it's easier for both of us if I give myself a name. I met Daniel, that's what I'll call him, when I was 26. I was working in a marketing firm downtown, exhausted, single, mildly convinced I was going to end up one of those women with 4 cats and a great Netflix queue. Then this guy walks into my friend's birthday party wearing the most confident smile I had ever seen on a man who was clearly a little nervous underneath it. He made me laugh within the first 5 minutes. That's rare for me. I don't laugh easily at strangers. We talked until the party ended, and then we talked in the parking lot for another hour after that, because neither of us wanted to be the one to say goodnight first. Within 6 months, we were basically living together. Within 2 years, he proposed on a hiking trail we used to do every Sunday at the exact spot where you could see the whole valley open up beneath you. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I want you to understand something. This wasn't a bad marriage. That's what makes this so much harder to tell. If this was a story about a man who was cruel to me every day, who yelled, who made me feel small, this would almost be simple. Easy to explain, easy for you to see coming. But Daniel was, by every visible measure, a good husband. He remembered our anniversaries. He brought me coffee in bed on weekends. He showed up to my mom's chemo appointments when I couldn't make myself walk through those doors alone. He was, as far as I could tell, one of the good ones. Daniel worked in regional sales for a medical equipment distributor, which meant travel, a lot of it. 2, sometimes 3 weeks a month, bouncing between cities, a territory that covered basically half the country. In the beginning, I hated it. I missed him, but it also meant that when he was home, he was really home, present, attentive. It felt like getting a vacation version of your husband every couple weeks, and honestly, for a while, I thought that was part of why our marriage worked so well. Absence making the heart grow fonder and all that. Looking back now, I can see it so clearly. The travel wasn't the accident of his job. It was the architecture of his entire second life. There were things, small things, that I noticed over the years and explained away the way I think most people do when they love someone and don't want to believe the alternative. He kept his phone face down, always had, since the day I met him, actually. I used to think it was just a habit, something his mother probably nagged him about as a teenager. Don't be rude, put your phone away. I never thought twice about it. He had a separate bank account for business expenses, which made sense because his company reimbursed him for travel and it kept things clean for taxes. Or so he said. Certain weeks, he'd go quiet in a specific way, not distant exactly, but careful, measured, like a man choosing his words before he spoke them instead of just talking to me the way he used to. And there was a city, Denver. He went there more than anywhere else on his route, at least 6 or 7 times a year, sometimes for 4 or 5 days at a stretch. When I asked about it once, early on, he told me it was where his biggest client was, some hospital network that needed constant hand-holding. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We don't go looking for reasons to distrust the people we love. We go looking for reasons to keep trusting them because the alternative is terrifying. I also think back now to our 5th anniversary, which fell right in the middle of what I now know was one of his Denver stretches. He'd called me that evening to say the trip had been extended a few days because a client meeting got pushed, and he sounded genuinely apologetic, almost rehearsed in how sorry he was. He sent flowers to my office the next morning with a card that said 5 years down, forever to go. I still have that card, actually. I kept it in a drawer for years as one of my favorite memories. I know now that our actual anniversary dinner, the one he supposedly missed because of a client meeting, happened to fall 2 days after what would have been his and Melissa's own dating anniversary. A fact I only pieced together once Denise's timeline came together months later. I don't know if that overlap was coincidence or a scheduling problem he juggled on purpose. I've stopped trying to guess at the specifics of how he managed it. I just know that flowers and a sweet card were apparently an efficient way to buy himself a few extra unquestioned days. There was one moment, maybe 4 years into our marriage, that I think about differently now than I did at the time. We were at a family barbecue at his sister's house, and one of his cousins, a little tipsy, laughing, made a joke about Daniel living the dream, one city, one wife, and Daniel laughed a beat too long before changing the subject. At the time, I thought it was just an awkward joke landing wrong. Now I think his cousin knew something and caught himself before he said too much. I want to be honest with you about something else, because this story only works if I'm honest with you the whole way through. There were nights I'd lie awake next to him, and some small, quiet part of my brain would ask a question I never let myself finish. What if? That was it, just those 2 words, and then I'd shut it down, roll over, and go to sleep. We had 2 kids together over the years, a boy and a girl. Daniel was genuinely a hands-on father when he was home. Bath time, bedtime stories, the whole thing. My friends used to tell me how lucky I was. I used to believe them. By year 8 of our marriage, our life looked, from the outside, close to perfect. Nice house in a good school district, 2 healthy kids, a husband with a good job who traveled but always came home, friends who envied what we had. I remember specifically a conversation with my coworker Angela, maybe a year before everything fell apart, where she told me flat out, half joking, "You and Daniel are basically the couple I compare my own marriage to and get depressed about." I laughed it off at the time. I actually felt a little proud. Looking back, there was a stretch of about 6 months, right around year 7, when Daniel seemed almost too good, more affectionate than usual, more generous with little gifts, flowers for no reason, a spa day booked for me out of nowhere, a weekend trip to the coast he planned entirely by himself. At the time, I thought maybe we were just entering a really solid, secure chapter of our marriage. Now I understand it differently. I think that was guilt dressed up as romance. I think a part of him knew what he was juggling, and the gifts were less about me and more about something he needed to quiet down inside himself. There was also a strange incident I'd almost forgotten about until all of this came out. Daniel came home from a trip once with a faint scar on his hand, a few stitches, and told me he'd cut it moving equipment at a client site. I remember feeling a flash of worry, kissing it, asking if he needed to see a doctor. He waved it off, said it was already handled. I never thought about it again until months later when I learned from a different piece of this story entirely that the injury actually happened while he was building a treehouse in a backyard I'd never seen for a little girl I didn't know existed. Small lies, I've come to learn, are rarely isolated. They're threads, and if you pull on just one, eventually the whole fabric of what you thought was true starts to come apart in your hands. I had absolutely no idea that coming home was only half of what Daniel was doing with his life. But what happened next, I never saw coming. It was a Tuesday in March, ordinary in every single way, right up until it wasn't. Our family cloud storage account was almost full, the kind of thing you ignore for months until your phone starts yelling at you about it. I finally sat down one evening after the kids went to bed to clean it out, delete duplicates, that kind of thing. Daniel was in Denver that week. Client trip, he'd said. I was scrolling through years of old photos, our wedding, the kids as babies, vacations, when I hit a folder I didn't recognize. It was labeled Work Trips 2. Not work trips, not Denver, just Work Trips 2, like there was already a Work Trips folder I'd never noticed tucked somewhere I hadn't thought to look. I clicked it out of pure curiosity, honestly, expecting hotel receipts or boring conference photos. Instead, I found 412 photos. A house I didn't recognize, a woman I didn't recognize, mid-30s, kind face, the kind of ordinary pretty that makes someone feel safe. And a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with Daniel's exact eyes and Daniel's exact smile sitting on Daniel's exact shoulders in a backyard I had never once seen in 8 years of marriage. I sat completely still for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. My brain kept doing this thing where it tried to build an innocent explanation and then immediately watched that explanation collapse under its own weight. An aunt? No, this woman kissed him in 3 separate photos. A coworker's kid? No, there was a photo dated 2 years back of the same little girl in a hospital bassinet, and Daniel was holding her, and someone had written, "Welcome to the world, baby girl," on a card visible in the frame. This wasn't an affair. An affair, as awful as it would have been, I think I could have almost processed faster. This was a second family. I want you to sit in this moment with me for a second, because I think anyone who has ever loved someone deeply needs to understand what this specific kind of shock does to a person. It's not just heartbreak. Heartbreak is what happens when someone you love hurts you. This was something else entirely. This was the realization that the man I had built an entire life with had been building an entire other life, brick by brick, in a city 3 states away, using time and money and love that I had assumed every single day for 8 years belonged only to me and our children. I went further into that folder because some sick, desperate part of me needed to know how deep this went. And it went deep. There were photos going back 5 years, birthday parties, a Christmas morning with a tree and stockings, and the woman's name stitched onto one of them, Melissa. A photo from what was unmistakably a wedding, a small one, backyard, maybe 30 guests. Daniel in a gray suit I actually recognized because I had picked it out for a work event 2 years prior, standing across from Melissa in a simple white dress, both of them smiling like the happiest people on earth. I had to read the date on that photo 3 times before it fully landed. He had married her. Legally, or what looked like legally, I didn't know yet, but it looked exactly like every wedding photo I had of my own marriage, 2 years after he married me. I kept scrolling almost against my own will at that point, the way you can't stop pressing on a bruise once you've found it. There were photos of Melissa pregnant, one hand on her belly, standing in front of what I now recognized as the same backyard from the wedding photos. There were photos of a nursery being painted, soft yellow, a mobile of little paper stars hanging above a crib, dated almost exactly 9 months before that little girl's hospital bassinet photo I'd already seen. There was a folder inside the folder labeled simply Anniversaries. 5 years of them. Restaurant photos, a candlelit table, Daniel's arm around Melissa's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I recognized one of the restaurants, not because I'd been there with him, but because I'd seen the name once on a credit card statement years earlier, a charge he explained away as dinner with the Denver sales team. I remember laughing once, a short, awful, humorless laugh, because in that exact same period of years, he'd taken me to dinner at an almost identical restaurant back home for our own anniversary, ordered almost the exact same meal, said almost the exact same toast. I wondered, sitting there, whether he even remembered which version of his life he was living at any given moment, or whether it had all just blurred together into one long performance he'd stopped noticing he was giving. I can't believe this. That's genuinely all my brain could produce as a full sentence for a long time. I can't believe this. I can't believe this. On a loop. I went back through my own memories that night, almost frantically, trying to line up dates. I pulled up my own phone's photo timeline next to his folder, side by side, comparing. There was a week, almost exactly 3 years earlier, where I'd posted a photo of myself and our daughter at her school's fall festival, captioned something sweet about missing Daddy, home soon. The date on that photo was 1 day before a photo in his folder of him at what was unmistakably a first birthday party, a 1 balloon floating behind Melissa's shoulder, his arm around her waist. 2 entire families celebrating 2 entirely different milestones, 4 days apart. And he'd been present, genuinely present, smiling in every photo, for both. I can't believe this. Again, louder in my head this time. I want to tell you what I did in that first hour, because I think it matters. I did not call him. I did not text him. I did not wake my children up and pack a bag and drive into the night, even though every cell in my body wanted to. I closed the laptop. I went and checked on my kids, sleeping soundly, completely unaware that their entire family structure had just been revealed as something built on a lie the size of a small country. I sat on the floor of their room in the dark for a long time, just breathing. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifted in me. The shock didn't go away, but underneath it, something colder and steadier started to form. Over the next several days, I did something that I think even surprised me. I kept acting completely normal. Daniel came home from his client trip that Friday, kissed me at the door, brought the kids a souvenir, told me about his week like it was any other week. I laughed at his jokes, I asked about his flight, I made dinner. And I watched him, really watched him, for the first time in years, the way you watch a stranger instead of someone you trust completely. I noticed things I'd trained myself not to notice, how he'd step into the garage to take certain calls, how his phone, which used to just sit face down on the counter, was now suddenly always in his pocket all the time, even at home, even in the shower he'd bring it into the bathroom on the counter. How there was a second charger cable in his car that didn't match any device I'd ever seen him use in our house. I can't believe this. I remember thinking it again, watching him tuck our son into bed that same night, kissing his forehead, saying, "I love you, buddy," in the exact same voice he must have used with that other little girl in Denver. The rage came later, not right away. Right away, it was just this strange floating numbness, like I was watching my own life from just outside my body. I went through the motions of an entire ordinary week like that, packing lunches, driving carpool, smiling at the neighbor over the fence, while carrying a secret so heavy I genuinely don't know, looking back, how I stood up straight under the weight of it. I remember standing in the shower one morning that week, water running cold because I'd been standing there so long, just staring at the tile, thinking about every single family photo hanging in our hallway, and wondering how many of those business trip days corresponded to birthdays and holidays I didn't know I was sharing my husband with. The rage showed up about a week in, and when it did, it showed up all at once, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was folding his laundry, his actual laundry, in our actual house, the socks and shirts of a man who had another entire wardrobe somewhere else, another entire life, another entire wife wearing a wedding ring he probably picked out the same way he picked out mine. I sat down on our bedroom floor with a pile of his shirts in my lap, and I finally let myself cry, not quiet crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep it scares you a little. But what happened next, I never saw coming, because it wasn't more crying, it was clarity. I remember wiping my face, standing up, and thinking one very specific sentence so clearly it felt like someone else had said it out loud in the room. He does not get to know I know until I decide he knows. That sentence became the whole foundation of everything that came after it. In the days that followed, I started noticing patterns I'd apparently been ignoring for years once I finally let myself look for them instead of around them. His client calls always happened behind a closed door, sure, but I notice now that they also always happened at almost exactly the same time each evening, like a routine. A bedtime call, I'd later understand, to a little girl who thought her daddy just worked very far away. I noticed that certain contacts in his phone had names that felt slightly off. Mike from Denver Sales, who texted him constantly at hours that didn't match any normal business schedule. I'd later learn Mike from Denver Sales didn't exist at all. It was simply how Melissa's number was saved, disguised in plain sight the entire time, sitting in a phone I had looked at 100 times over the years without ever once suspecting a thing. I noticed the way he talked about the Denver trip differently than every other trip, more detail, more warmth in his voice, even when he thought he was just complaining about a long flight. I used to think that warmth was just relief at being productive at work. Now I understood it was something else completely, the sound of a man talking without realizing it about a home he loved. Because here's the thing you need to understand about a man like Daniel. He was smart. He was careful. He had built and maintained 2 entire households, 2 families, 2 sets of holidays and birthdays and bedtime routines for 5 years without a single crack showing on either side. If I confronted him in that moment, full of rage, full of tears, he would have had time to prepare, time to hide money, time to lawyer up, time to warn Melissa, coach his story, maybe even disappear entirely with whatever he could grab in a hurry. I wasn't going to give him that time. I decided right there on that bedroom floor that I was done being the woman this happened to. I was going to become the woman who made sure it never happened to anyone else again, and who made absolutely sure that when the truth came out, it came out in a way he could never spin, never soften, and never survive unscathed. But first, I needed a plan, and plans like this don't happen overnight. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It was my sister, Rachel. I drove to her house instead of calling, because some things you need to say with your whole face, not just your voice. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything: the folder, the photos, the wedding, the little girl with Daniel's smile. Rachel didn't say a single word for almost a full minute. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Okay, what do you need from me, and how fast do you need it?" That's the kind of ally you want in a moment like this, not someone who spirals with you, someone who steadies you and asks what's next. I told her my plan, or at least the beginning of it, because honestly, the full plan built itself over the following weeks. But the foundation was simple, and it was 3 things. 1, document everything without him knowing. 2, protect the money before he could move it or hide it. 3, Make sure that when this came out, it came out through channels he couldn't argue with, couldn't charm his way around, or couldn't blame me for being an emotional wife who misunderstood something. The documentation part started with the photos themselves. I didn't just screenshot them, I downloaded every single image with the original metadata intact onto a drive that never touched our shared cloud account again. Dates, file properties, location data where it existed. I made 3 copies. One stayed with Rachel. One went into a safety deposit box I opened by myself under my name only at a bank Daniel had never used. One I kept encrypted on a laptop that lived from that point forward in my car. I started keeping a written log, too. Dates of his trips, what he told me about each one, anything that didn't line up, any receipt I happened to see, any credit card charge in a city that didn't match his supposed itinerary. I wrote it by hand in a notebook because paper doesn't sync to any cloud account he might have access to. Then I hired a private investigator. Her name was Denise, referred to me by a divorce attorney friend of Rachel's, and she specialized in exactly this kind of situation. She'd seen bigamy cases before, more than you'd think, actually, which honestly made me feel a little less alone and a lot more furious on behalf of every woman before me who'd sat where I was sitting. Denise confirmed, within about 3 weeks, what the photos already strongly suggested. Daniel had, in fact, legally married Melissa 2 years after marrying me, using a slightly altered version of his middle name on the marriage certificate, enough to make a basic background check come back clean, but not enough to survive an actual investigation. Melissa believed completely that he was his only wife. She had no idea I existed. She had no idea our children existed. That detail mattered to me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and I need you to hold on to it because it comes back later in a way that surprised me completely. The financial piece came next, and this is the part that took the most nerve because I had to do it while still living under the same roof as him, still cooking his dinner, still sleeping in the same bed some nights without a single flicker of what I knew showing on my face. I opened a separate account in my name only, funded slowly, and small transfers that wouldn't trigger any alert on our joint statements. I pulled our credit reports, both of ours, which I was legally entitled to do as his spouse, and found exactly what I suspected. A second mortgage in Colorado under his slightly altered name that I had never once heard about. Money moving out of our joint accounts in amounts just small enough to avoid drawing my attention over the years, funneled, we'd later learn, toward Melissa's household expenses. I can't believe this, I remember thinking, staring at those statements. Years of our joint income, our joint savings, quietly bleeding out to support a life I wasn't even allowed to know existed. I met with a divorce attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who Rachel's friend also connected me with, and laid out everything. Patricia told me something that became my mantra for the next 2 months. The person who moves first with the most documentation wins. Emotion loses cases. Preparation wins them. So that's what I did. I prepared. There were near misses along the way, and I want to tell you about 2 of them because they still make my stomach drop a little even now. The first happened about 6 weeks into the process. Daniel came home a day early from a trip, no warning, just walked in the door on a Wednesday afternoon instead of Thursday, and I had my documentation laptop sitting on the kitchen counter, open mid-review of Denise's latest report. I heard his key in the door and had maybe 4 seconds. I closed the laptop, slid it into a grocery bag on the counter like it was just sitting there waiting to be put away, and turned around smiling just as he walked in. He never suspected a thing, but my hands were shaking for an hour after he left the room. The second near miss was worse. Denise, doing surveillance near Melissa's home in Denver, got a little too close, and Melissa's neighbor mentioned to Melissa that a woman had been asking around about the family. Melissa apparently mentioned this to Daniel, half joking, and for about 4 days I genuinely thought he might have figured it out. He was distracted, quieter than usual, and I spent those 4 days absolutely convinced my entire plan was about to collapse. It didn't. Denise had been careful enough, and Daniel apparently chalked it up to nothing, but I remember lying awake that week thinking about what would happen if he found out I knew before I was ready, whether he'd run, whether he'd try to drain accounts overnight, whether he'd try to turn it around on me somehow. That fear is exactly why I moved as fast and as carefully as I did. There was a third near miss right near the end of this whole planning phase that honestly scared me more than the first two combined. Our son, who was 7 at the time, mentioned offhand at dinner one night that Daddy had told him a bedtime story on the phone about his other kids. I froze mid-bite. Daniel laughed it off instantly, said he must have been telling a made-up story about imaginary friends, and our son shrugged and moved on to talking about dinosaurs. I sat there smiling along with them, cutting up my daughter's chicken, while every part of me wanted to ask 100 more questions. I couldn't, not yet. Patricia had been clear with me. One wrong move, one slipped question, and he could feel the ground shifting under him before I was ready to pull the floor out entirely. So I let it go in front of them, and I wrote every word of that conversation down in my notebook the second the kids went to bed. Patricia and I met 4 separate times over those 2 months, refining the filing so there wasn't a single gap for his attorney to exploit. She walked me through exactly how the fraud and bigamy findings would strengthen my position on asset division, explaining that courts in our state take a dim view of a spouse who's diverted marital funds toward concealing a second household. It isn't just betrayal in the eyes of the law, it's a breach that can shift the entire financial settlement in the wrong spouse's favor. She also prepared me for the emotional reality of what was coming, warning me that Daniel would very likely try to minimize everything, to make it sound smaller and more forgivable than it was. People like this, she told me once, don't unravel gracefully. They unravel by trying to make you look unreasonable for being furious about something completely unreasonable that they did. She was right, almost word for word about exactly what would happen. Somewhere around the 6-week mark, I brought one more person into the plan, my mother, who I'd initially wanted to shield from all of this because she genuinely adored Daniel and I didn't know how she'd handle the shock. But Rachel convinced me I needed more than one ally close to the kids, someone who could take them for a weekend on short notice without questions, someone I trusted completely with their safety while the rest of this unfolded. My mother took the news the way I should have expected, with about 10 minutes of stunned silence, followed by an almost frightening level of calm, followed by, "Tell me exactly what you need me to do and I'll do it." That's the other thing nobody tells you about a betrayal this size. You find out very quickly exactly who in your life is built for a crisis and who isn't. I lost one friend during this process, someone who found the whole thing too intense to be around. I gained a level of closeness with my sister and my mother that I don't think I ever would have found any other way. Denise, the investigator, turned out to be worth every cent I paid her, and then some. She didn't just confirm the marriage and the financial diversion. She built a full timeline, cross-referencing Daniel's company travel records against flight data, hotel confirmations, and even a gym membership he'd apparently had in Denver for 4 years under his altered name. She found the mortgage documents. She found a joint checking account between him and Melissa that had been open since almost the exact month their daughter was born. Every piece of it, time-stamped, sourced, and organized into a binder that Patricia later told me was the cleanest case file she'd seen walk through her door in a decade. I also spent those weeks quietly building my own financial literacy in a way I never had before. I'd always let Daniel handle the big picture of our money, something I deeply regret now and would tell any woman watching this never to do, no matter how much you trust your partner. I learned where every one of our accounts actually sat, I learned what a forensic accountant does and hired one, on Patricia's recommendation, to trace exactly how much money had left our joint accounts over the years and where it had gone. The number, when it finally came back, was larger than I'd braced myself for, north of $200,000 over 5 years, quietly funneled out an amount small enough to never raise a single red flag on a monthly statement. By the 2-month mark, I had everything I needed: a paper trail of the bigamous marriage, financial records showing years of funds diverted to a second household, a private investigator's full report, time-stamped and notarized, a forensic accounting summary, a divorce attorney with a filing ready to go, a separate account with enough of my own money secured to make sure I would never be financially trapped no matter what happened next. And I had one more thing: a decision about Melissa. Patricia, my attorney, told me flatly that legally I owed Melissa nothing. She wasn't my responsibility. But I kept coming back to one image: Melissa in those photos, decorating a Christmas tree, completely certain she was the only woman in Daniel's life, the same way I had been certain for 8 years. I made a decision that I think ended up being the smartest part of this entire plan. I decided that when this came out, Melissa was going to hear the truth from me, directly, with proof in hand, at the exact same moment everything else came crashing down. Not from Daniel, not from gossip, not from some lawyer's letter months later, from another woman who understood completely what she was about to feel. But what happened next, I never saw coming, because the day I chose to execute this plan turned into something even bigger than I'd built it to be. I picked a Thursday. Daniel was scheduled to fly to Denver that morning, which meant by the time everything unfolded, he'd be standing in the middle of the life he thought I knew nothing about. The plan had 4 moving parts, all timed to happen within about 6 hours of each other, so there was no window for him to get ahead of any single piece of it. Part 1, Patricia filed for divorce that morning, along with a motion to freeze our joint accounts, citing the discovered financial misconduct. That filing hit the system and, more importantly, hit his email inbox as an official notice right around 10 a.m. Part 2, I had already quietly over the previous week moved my half of our legitimately joint, legally accessible funds into my own protected account on Patricia's advice, entirely within our state's legal guidelines for a spouse anticipating divorce. Nothing hidden, nothing illegal, just no longer sitting somewhere Daniel could touch it first. Part 3, Denise's full report, along with copies of the marriage certificate from Colorado, went to Daniel's employer that same morning. Not out of spite alone, though I won't pretend that wasn't satisfying, but because his company reimbursed his travel expenses, and a significant portion of those client visit trips to Denver were, according to Denise's timeline, actually family time with Melissa, billed to the company as work travel. That's not just a moral problem, that's expense fraud. And part 4, the part I'd thought about longest. I called Melissa myself. I want to walk you through this call because I think it's the moment in this entire story that people react to the most. I introduced myself. I told her my name, and I told her I was married to Daniel, legally married first, 8 years before she was. I could hear her go completely silent on the other end of the line, that specific kind of silence that only happens when someone's entire understanding of their life just cracked open. I told her I wasn't calling to hurt her. I told her I knew, better than almost anyone on earth could, exactly what she was about to feel, because I'd felt it too just a few months earlier. I told her I had documentation, everything, marriage records, financial records, the works, and that I would send it to her immediately so she wasn't left scrambling for answers the way I had been. she cried. Then she got angry, but not at me, at him. She kept saying, "He told me you were his ex. He said you two had been divorced for years. He said—" And then she just stopped because she realized mid-sentence that everything he'd ever told her was probably built on the same kind of lie. Here's the twist I did not see coming when I started this plan, the one I promised you back at the beginning of this video. Melissa and I ended up on the same side. Not immediately. That first call was too raw, too shocking for either of us to think clearly. But over the following weeks, as both of our lives collapsed and rebuilt at the same time, we started talking, comparing notes, comparing photos, dates, stories he told each of us that were almost identical, just with different names swapped in. We realized together exactly how much of our combined money, my joint accounts, her joint accounts, had gone toward maintaining this double life he was so proud of. We realized he'd used nearly identical proposal lines on both of us. We realized her daughter and my son had almost the exact same middle name because apparently Daniel just recycled the ones he liked. I know some of you are screaming right now. I felt it too. That specific kind of vindication that comes from watching two women who could have been pitted against each other by a man like this instead turn around and become each other's strongest witnesses. Yes, that's moment number one. Sit with that for a second because it only gets better. By that afternoon, Daniel's employer had launched an internal investigation into years of falsified expense reports, which, combined with the fraud implications, led to his termination within the month. Not from my report alone, because the paper trail Denise compiled was airtight, and companies do not like discovering that kind of exposure hanging over them. The bigamy itself, legally marrying a second person while still legally married to the first, is a criminal offense in our state. Once Melissa understood the full truth, she made her own decision, entirely her own, to file a police report. I didn't push her to it. I didn't need to. She was, understandably, done protecting a man who had never once told her the truth about anything that mattered. Daniel was charged. I'm not going to pretend the criminal process moved fast, because it didn't. These things rarely do, but it moved steadily, in exactly the direction it needed to. The divorce, on my end, moved faster because Patricia had built our case so thoroughly there was almost nothing left for his attorney to argue. The financial misconduct, the diverted funds, the years of deception, all of it factored into a settlement that left me and our children financially secure in a way I genuinely hadn't expected going in. I kept the house. I kept primary custody. I walked away without a single cent of debt tied to a life he'd built behind my back. That's yes moment number 2 if you're keeping count. Here's the part that still, even now, makes me feel something complicated whenever I think about it. The unexpected twist wasn't just Melissa becoming an ally. It was watching Daniel, a man who had spent 5 years being so careful, so controlled, so good at keeping 2 entire lives perfectly separate, completely unravel the moment he no longer had control over the story. He tried at first to paint himself as confused, torn between 2 families he genuinely loved. He tried later, when that didn't land, to paint me as vindictive, as the one who destroyed the family by exposing him instead of quietly divorcing him and moving on. Nobody bought it. Not the judge reviewing Patricia's documentation, not his own family, several of whom quietly reached out to apologize to me once the full picture came out, including, notably, the cousin from that barbecue years earlier, who admitted he'd suspected something for a long time and deeply regretted the joke he'd made that day. Not even Melissa's own family, who rallied around her the same way Rachel had rallied around me. I think that's the real twist buried underneath the bigger one, that a man who built his entire second life on the belief that no one would ever compare notes ended up losing everything specifically because 2 women decided to stop competing and start comparing notes instead. I want to tell you about the day Daniel actually found out everything had unraveled, because Denise, still technically on retainer for a few final follow-up items, happened to be near enough to the situation to piece together what happened. He landed in Denver that Thursday morning, expecting a normal work trip, only to find 3 missed calls from his employer's HR department, an email notice of an internal investigation, and a text from Melissa that simply said, "We need to talk now. Come to the house." By the time he walked through her front door, she already had the documentation printed out on the kitchen table. The marriage certificate under his altered name, my marriage certificate from 8 years earlier, screenshots of the diverted funds. She didn't yell, according to what she told me later. She said she just sat there watching him try to find an explanation that didn't exist. Watching him go through every excuse he'd probably used 100 times before on smaller lies, and watching every single one of them fail to land for the first time in his life. He tried calling me that same afternoon 17 times over about 4 hours. I didn't answer a single call. Patricia had advised me from the very beginning that all communication from that point forward would go through her office, and I stuck to that completely. There is a specific kind of power in silence when someone has spent years assuming you'd always be reachable, always available to smooth things over for him. I wasn't available anymore, not to him. The custody arrangement ended up being one of the more straightforward parts of the process, honestly, because Daniel's own legal troubles worked against him there without me needing to argue much of anything. Between the criminal bigamy charge, the fraud investigation at his former employer, and the financial instability that followed his termination, the court had very little difficulty granting me primary physical custody with a limited supervised visitation schedule to start, subject to review. I remember sitting in Patricia's office the day the custody order was finalized and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph exactly, but relief, a settling, like a held breath finally being let out after months of holding it. Word travels fast in a small professional community, and Daniel's industry, medical equipment sales, turned out to be smaller than either of us realized. Within a couple of months, it became clear that his reputation had followed him everywhere he tried to go next. 2 separate job opportunities he was reportedly lined up for fell through once background checks turned up the pending charges. I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't need to. Documentation, once it's public record, has a way of doing that work on its own. His extended family split, more or less, right down the middle. Some tried to stay neutral, which I understood even if it stung. Others, his mother notably, reached out to me directly, tearfully, to apologize for a son she said she genuinely didn't recognize anymore. She still calls sometimes to check on the kids, and honestly, I've let her, because they're still her grandchildren, and none of this was ever their fault or hers. Melissa and I still talk occasionally, even now. Not constantly, we're not best friends, and I don't think either of us needed that from this. But there's a specific kind of bond that forms between 2 women who were both deceived by the same person in almost identical ways, and I think we both find something steadying in knowing the other one understands exactly what it felt like without needing it explained. There's one more moment I want to give you because I think it's the most satisfying one of all, and it happened almost by accident. About 4 months after everything came out, I ran into an old mutual friend of ours at the grocery store, someone who'd known Daniel for years before I even met him. She asked carefully how I was doing, clearly bracing for me to be a wreck. I told her honestly that I was doing better than I had in years. Not because the betrayal didn't hurt, it did, more than almost anything I've ever gone through, but because for the first time in a long time, my life was entirely, completely mine. No hidden folders, no unexplained trips, no quiet floating sense that something wasn't adding up. She looked at me for a second and said, "You know, I always thought you 2 had the perfect marriage." And I told her, so did I. Turns out I just had half of it. That's yes moment number 3. And I think it's the one that matters most because it's not about him losing everything. It's about me realizing exactly how much I'd already won just by refusing to stay quiet. Looking back on all of this now, a couple years out, I think about the version of myself sitting in that parking lot, hands shaking, staring at a photo that broke my entire understanding of my own life. I didn't know in that moment that I was capable of the kind of cold, patient, methodical response that followed. I think most of us don't know that about ourselves until we're forced to find out. What I learned more than anything is that the version of winning that feels best isn't the loud one. It's not screaming in a parking lot or throwing his stuff on the front lawn, however tempting that might be in the moment. It's the quiet, documented, legally airtight version. The one where, when the truth finally comes out, there's absolutely nothing left for him to spin. I also learned that the women men like Daniel try to pit against each other are so often each other's greatest allies if you just give them the chance and the truth at the same time. I think about my kids a lot when I reflect on all this. They're older now, old enough eventually to understand more of what happened, and I've made a promise to myself that when those questions come, I'll answer them honestly in an age-appropriate way without ever using them as a weapon against their father. That part matters to me more than almost anything else. Whatever Daniel did to me, whatever he did to Melissa, my children didn't choose any of it, and they deserved a mother who handled this as much grace as the situation allowed, even underneath all that cold, calculated planning. If you're sitting somewhere right now, quietly suspecting something isn't adding up in your own relationship, I'm not telling you to panic, and I'm not telling you to accuse anyone of anything. I'm telling you to trust that instinct enough to quietly start paying attention. Document, protect yourself first. Let the truth reveal itself before you reveal that you know it. I genuinely love to know, if you were in my position, sitting in that parking lot with that photo on your screen, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him that night, or would you have played it the way I did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story kept you here until the very end, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories like this one coming, and trust me, some of them get even wilder than mine did. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.